Welcome back to another version of Movement is a Lifestyle. It's been a couple of years because of COVID, but we still believe that movement is important and movement is part of what makes your life complete, hence the reason for having movement as a lifestyle. And unfortunately or fortunately, when you're involved in movement and when you like to move, whether it's a specific sport or a specific activity, eventually, sometime you will get hurt, whether it's now or in the future. So we thought it would be a good idea to kick off the second rendition of Movement as a Lifestyle with a physical therapist to talk about it a little bit, because a physical therapist is not just for when you get hurt, but they can be very helpful before you get hurt. So we're fortunate enough to have Kelly Kuhn of Kelly Kuhn Physical Therapy to agree to join us. And we're going to talk a little bit about running injuries, things you can do to potentially prevent them, understanding that we're filming this when it's about 50 degrees and they're calling for snow tonight, even though 2 days ago it was 80 degrees. So Kelly, thank you for taking time to join Movement as a Lifestyle.
Thanks for having me.
I guess one of the first things I always like to do when I interview you, and I've had the opportunity to do it in a number of venues, is to get you to tell a little bit about how your physical therapy practice differs from other physical therapy practices, because you don't have a set in stone bricks and mortar office.
Nope, I've been practicing with telehealth since 2019, when nobody knew what telehealth was, and now we all know what telehealth is. But I am able to work remotely, even PT, because most of what I do is guiding people. We are able to do exercises on the Zoom or the webcam to be able to show them and make sure their technique is correct, and I'm able to assess them on the webcam. But a big part of my time is guiding them through, so it's a lot of talking, and that works wonderful for this population with runners via telehealth.
And I know we treat movement as a lifestyle. And one of the things that maybe differs in physical therapy from the way it differed maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago is very often a lot of people who went to physical therapy, their idea of going to physical therapy is they'd get the hot pack, maybe they get a little bit of ultrasound and you're shaking your head. And if you were really fortunate, you'd get a little localized tissue massage. And physical therapy has really adapted and changed. Obviously, those things would not work well with telehealth. What would a typical sort of visit for somebody who's maybe having some shin pain and they contact you because you do have direct access with patients?
So I would first talk. I mean, we'd spend a lot of time talking because I want to understand the patient. I want to know what's going on in their life, like their stressors, their diet, their nutrition, their sleep patterns, because all of that plays a part into injuries much more than we've ever given it credit for. So we're going to spend a lot of time figuring that out. I'm also going to figure out their training style, what works for them, what doesn't work for them, how much they're doing, and how they're fitting their training style in their life, because no two people have the same schedule or the same life, so giving a one-size-fits-all training schedule isn't going to work. So we do all of that before we even do any physical exercise. Then I'll take them through an assessment to see how they're tolerating load through the areas that we load when we're running. So for example, the ankle or the knee, can they handle positions that mimic the demands of running. And then from there we'll come up with a program that includes their training schedule, or how to adjust their training schedule, exercises, and then different ways to monitor themselves to know when to back off a little bit, when to move a little faster, how to progress their exercises, all of that. So that would all be within our first couple training sessions.
And I think one of the things you mentioned that maybe you take for granted, that I think many people with a past experience with physical therapy may not take for granted, is you mentioned our first session we may talk a lot. And I know one of the great things about modern medicine is you can get in to see physical therapists who have access to lots of toys and tools. One of the disadvantages is very often in a typical physical therapy session, you may only have 15 minutes or 20 minutes with the therapist. Maybe the first time you get an hour. And what you're doing with telehealth is not necessarily limited to telehealth, but because you're in private practice. Talk a little bit about the importance of not being able to spend just 15 minutes, but being able to spend 30, 45, or I would imagine on occasion, sometimes even more than an hour with a single patient.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes my initial evaluation is over 2 hours. And I've started breaking that up into more sessions because it just becomes too long, because you cannot get to know a person and get to know their training schedule and their diet and their sleep and their stress and their life and what makes them tick in 15 minutes or an hour. You need to be able to do all that, and you need to give them a chance to talk to you and tell you how they feel about things, and how, because ultimately I'm asking them to make a behavior change. I'm asking them to change their program. I'm asking them to do exercises. So if I just tell them to do it, they're not going to do it. I have to let them talk. I have to hear them, and I have to let it fit for them. And if we only have 15 minutes or even an hour, that's just not going to happen. And that's why we often have healthcare that fails, because we're not taking the patient into account.
I know one of the things that helps if you're a runner or you're active in any sort of way is to have somebody, whether their official name is coach or somebody who does not have a psychological stake in what's going on. So if I'm a runner, and I am, although I'm a little bit older, I have people that I can bounce ideas off of so they can look at me and say, Ben, that's a stupid idea. And I know one of the popular things, we're filming this the week of the Pittsburgh Marathon, and there's going to be literally in all of the events, thousands of people who are running the various distances. And one of the things that often happens is people get excited because there is the sense of community, there is the aspect I can run with my friends, maybe I can run with my family in some of the distances. And I would imagine as somebody who sees patients who are injured, or they come to you because you're injured, you sometimes have to have that difficult conversation. How do you approach it for the person who's highly motivated and you're looking at what they're trying to do and you realize that, you know, a marathon is something that's realistic, but maybe right now, because as you mentioned, sleep, work, other things, how do you approach that with them? And I know you don't tell them what to do, but you offer guidance. How do you approach that? Because that's a difficult conversation.
It is a difficult conversation, and it's very dependent on the person, because two people will handle that differently and get to that conclusion on their own that they shouldn't run, which is ultimately it is, because I can tell them not to run it, but they still have to come to that decision on their own. So it's more of pointing the pros and cons of like what happens if you run this and you have a catastrophic injury like a high risk bone stress fracture that can set you out for at least a year, or sometimes it can be career ending, you know, or if you do run this and, you know, you don't do as well, there's psychological issues with that, you don't hit your goal, and there's lots of things that can go wrong with running something you're not prepared for. So how can I get them to see that there is the benefit of next year's marathon or a slower race or a shorter race? So maybe we can substitute with something that gives them that feel of the challenge, that gives them something to do. They still feel like they're there on race day. Maybe not, it depends on the person. And then how do I get them to see that, you know what, this isn't the end, this is a step, and this is a long-term goal. Running is a lifetime activity. I don't want to give that up for this one race. I would like to be able to do multiple races. So let me take the time, do it right, complete my rehab, and then come back to it.
And I know you're in an interesting position that you have kids who you are also coaching. And one of the things that's very interesting is people do these events and these activities for different reasons. With what I mentioned a few moments ago, people doing it maybe for the sense of community, et cetera, you get a lot of people who may decide they're going to participate in a running activity and maybe they've never run before. And on the one hand, that's wonderful because it's opening them up to movement opportunities. I mean, I know I've mentioned before, some of my best friends come from people I met through running or doing triathlons. But on the other hand, it's very easy to compare yourself. If you and I went out for a run, you have different musculoskeletal problems. I have different musculoskeletal problems. And it's very common to say to your friend, hey, come do this with me. And maybe they're not ready to do that. So somebody who's looking at doing an event, obviously the week of the Pittsburgh Marathon, it's a little late to say I'm going to run the Pittsburgh Marathon, but we're starting to get into the range for summer races, to start to get into the range for maybe somebody saying, you know, I'm not ready for the Pittsburgh Marathon, I'd like to do a fall marathon. Is there a benefit to consulting with a physical therapist or an experienced run coach prior to even beginning a training program, or should you wait until you're hurt?
No, you should definitely do it before, because again, there's a lot of information there. There's a lot to go over. If we've never run a race before and you just go, are you ready for it? Should a marathon be the first race you run? And probably not. And then all of the misinformation out there. You're running with a friend. Is your pace going to be the same as theirs? Probably not. Is your foot strike going to be the same as theirs? No, probably not. Is your cadence going to be the same? So starting to learn what running actually is, how it should look for you, you know, instead of getting all the misinformation, and then structuring the proper running program to build you up to that marathon after you've done some other races first is a great idea. Jumping into a group run with a marathon is not a great idea. It happens a lot, and some people make it and they're successful with it, but it's probably not the best idea, and it is a recipe for injuries.
And I know this is kind of a hotspot question to ask. I know there are physical therapists with different levels of expertise, running coaches with different levels of expertise, but say there is an experienced run coach for working with beginning runners, and there is a physical therapist who is experienced with working with runners. For somebody who's a neophyte runner or a newbie who's just starting something, where should they go first? Should they go for the run coach and maybe hire the run coach to train them? Should they do an initial session with a physical therapist? Would it be better to say, I'm going to work with a physical therapist and the run coach too? Or how should that work for somebody, in your opinion?
Again, there's no one size fits all. So I mean, it doesn't hurt to consult anybody. So go to the run coach, talk with them, find out, ask their philosophy, do a little research online. I mean, I know that's tough. You have to be careful where you go with sites, but I think doing research online shouldn't be to make your decision. It should be to ask the right questions, so you know what questions to ask. It doesn't mean that you read something online and you take that as gold. You ask the question and then listen how they work with you. Do you feel comfortable with them? Because ultimately, you're only going to do something for somebody that makes you feel comfortable, and you have to respect them and feel that they're listening to you, because then you'll follow through with their plan. If somebody doesn't make you feel that way and they feel like they're just talking at you, running's a high motivation sport. You have to really be motivated to stick with it. You really have to trust that provider. So I think the idea is, whether it's a run coach or a physical therapist, it really matters how they relate to you and you relate to them more than their actual credentials. And also, are they taking the time to look at everything? Are they giving you just, here's my running plan, here's what everybody does, walk away. Walk away. They don't ask you about sleep and your diet and your nutrition and ask you about you, walk away, because that's not going to work for you. So I think those are the more important things to look for than necessarily the right credentials.
And I know you mentioned the fact that running at different paces, you and I may have a different pace if you decide you're going to put me through a marathon training program. Mm-hmm. Very often as a physical therapist, you see somebody after they've become injured. Mm-hmm. And you ask all those questions and you determine that they're doing their training with their best friend who happens to be an experienced runner, and they love that sense of community. They love meeting their friend. They love the group runs. And maybe that friend and those group runs are too fast, not forever, but for that period of time. You're offering them advice. How do you broach that topic of saying, hey, this is all great that you're doing this, but it's also contributing to why you're hurt, and if you can back off doing it this way and maybe do some solo runs or find a slower group, or in some cases a faster group, because running slow could cause just as many problems as running fast. Yeah,
it depends on where you're going and what you're in, like if you're having an injury. So for people with knee pain, it might actually be more beneficial to run faster, because everything is just about shifting the load. So when we go faster, the load moves up to the knee. When we run slower, it might shift down. When we run faster, the load shifts to the Achilles. When we run slower, it shifts off the knee. So, it shifts to the knee. I just said that all wrong, but you know what I meant. So if we're, so you have to go try to think about what they need for their specific run, and then what they value. If they really are valuing that social group, can we find that somewhere else? Can we find that in a running group? Can we find that with matching them up with a partner? Can we encourage them to do a solo run, or maybe a solo run with a podcast? Something that matters to them, that will make it enjoyable for them. And so I think this comes down to knowing who you're working with, problem solving with them, instead of saying, that's it, you can't run with that person, because that's not going to work. You have to problem solve and find what will work. And there's lots of options and lots of opportunities. It just depends on the person and what they're open to and what they like.
And I've often joked semi-seriously that you can divide runners into two groups: those people who have been injured and those people who haven't been injured yet, because you are applying loads and you do have input on everything else that's going on in your life. So what you did when you were 20 may not work when you're 25, when you actually have to work and maybe have children. Mm-hmm. And I know there's a lot of miscommunication out there. There's one of the things you can say is, one of the great things about the internet is there's a lot of information. But by the same token, one of the bad things about the internet is there's a lot of information. So talk a little bit about, and I know you've been in physical therapy practice for a few years. It used to be, if you had knee pain, it was, say, for example, anterior knee pain. Obviously we're not going to diagnose here, but the diagnosis would be, oh, you have tendinitis, mm-hmm. or you have tendinosis. And that kind of has changed. For people who aren't familiar what the terminology is with tendons, and tendons connect muscle to bone. So every place you have a muscle, it attaches to the bone with a tendon, and those tendons respond to load either by getting inflamed or getting stronger, or in some cases changing structurally. Talk a little bit about the terminology, so if somebody's searching the googly web or the physical therapist or somebody says something and they're like, I don't know what that means.
Right, so we've switched more to the term tendinopathy, which is more the catch-all for a pain within a tendon. And so what we're noticing is that, yes, there is tendinitis. Itis is inflammation, and that is usually secondary to a tendinopathy, because a lot of people don't realize this, but our tissues, our tendons, and our bones are living structures. They're changing all the time. And so our tendon is made up of collagen, and when we overload it and we have an injury, we change that collagen makeup, at least temporarily, while it's healing. So there's this change to the structure of the tendon, and then there might be a secondary inflammation. And so right then and there, and that's the tendinitis. The secondary inflammation is not that problematic, but we have traditionally gone after it with NSAIDs and shots, and we know that's not the way to treat it and actually can create more problems down the line. So we actually want to get to the collagen makeup, that change in the tendon. So that's where we call the tendinopathy. And we would treat that with exercise. We treat it with exercise, and we would also treat it by not stretching because that tendon has to carry load, and it has to carry two different types of forces. A tensile force, that's that stretching and contracting, like some muscles that shorten and contract and shorten, and they have to handle compressive loads. So as that tendon stretches, it pushes in on the bone. And that is actually really, really a high load for the tendons, and that's really, really an irritating load. And so when we have a tendinopathy, that can really, really hurt. But the traditional advice is stretch the tendon. So now you're taking an irritated structure and you're irritating it and irritating it and irritating it more. And that's, the tendon is not tight. It's not limited in range of motion. It's just irritated. So we need to stop stretching tendons. That's probably the number one. And then we need to start slowly strengthening them, avoiding temporarily the painful range a little bit, and then slowly moving into it. And the problem with that is a lot of times people hear the word avoid or limit, and then they think that that range is bad, and that's not the case. So for like a squat, for a patella tendon, you know, I would maybe initially not let my knee come over my toes because I'm just trying to because that's the position that puts the most load on that tendon. So I want to calm it down, so I don't want to put a lot of load on it. But then eventually I need to let my knee come over my toes to actually build that tendon up. But a lot of times what you hear is never let the knee come over the toes, and that's wrong. So we have to be careful with creating these fear avoidance patterns. Everywhere a body moves is safe and acceptable. We just have to be able to tolerate it. So I think that's kind of the biggest change in how we're treating tendons. Is it's okay to go into those postures. We may hold off on them temporarily, but we're going to move into them, and we're not going to stretch them as much as we used to.
And you hit on two things that I want to dive a little deeper on too. First of all, you said the change in thought has been that before we would stretch the tendon or do hot packs or do ultrasound and things like that, and now we're using exercise. So when you're referring to exercise, are you referring to resistance training, whether it's body weight training or with weights, or are you referring to, as I'm making the stereotypical runner comment, oh, exercise, that means I should run more? Which are you referring to when you say for tendons we want to exercise them?
So a little bit of both, actually. So you can run with a tendinopathy. You probably have to back off. You have to find an acceptable range where we're not limping or changing our form and that the pain is staying stable. That's not true for all injuries, but for tendinopathies, you can run through them. You might need to take some time off, and then you have to back off and build back up. But most importantly, we do need to do resistance training because we want our tendons respond to load, and so that load builds them up, makes them more capable to handle a run, because a run is a high load activity, makes them stronger, and it allows them to be able to handle the demands of running. So we will progress from a heavy load, slow, and then we're going to eventually move that up, make it heavier, and move into a fast, heavy load, like jumping or plyometrics. And that, when we can get to that, we know that our tendons are really doing well and can handle the demands of running. But you can run during that process.
And then I'll ask the question for somebody if they were an inexperienced runner or somebody who wasn't experienced with moving. So once my tendinopathy is better, I don't have pain and I can run again, then I can stop doing those resistance training exercises?
No, you can't stop. Well, you can. You absolutely can. You can do whatever you want. But you're going to do better if you keep some resistance training into your program. You might, during the heavier times of your running, like as you're getting close to a race, you might hold off on it for temporarily, allow a little time, and then build it back up in the off season. So it might ebb and flow how much you do, but you're more likely to tolerate running without an injury, or with less injuries, because injuries happen, if you do keep some resistance training into your program.
And then you mentioned something else, that previously maybe the idea was somebody had a little tendinopathy, which then they may have called it tendinitis or tendinosis or tendon something, and they would say, well, stretch it. And now we say, don't stretch it. So since we know muscles attached to tendons, does that mean we shouldn't stretch that muscle? So if I've got Achilles tendinitis, does that mean I don't stretch my calf?
Nope. So you wouldn't, that would be the aggravating position, stretching the calf. You'd be taking the tendon into the aggravating position. And most times we don't need to stretch, because the idea that muscle is short is not true. And actually we do need some stiffness in a muscle anyway, because when that muscle contracts like a rubber, lengthens like a rubber band, and then it contracts, it needs to be able to come back, and that's what propels us forward. If we overstretch a rubber band, it doesn't come back as far. It actually loses some of that stiffness and can't propel us forward. That sensation of tightness that we might feel, that's just a muscle that's mad or cranky or irritated. That's a sensation from our brain. That is not a shortened muscle. So the idea that tight muscles are shortened and need to be stretched is an incorrect idea. And so sometimes people like stretching for mental purposes, or it feels good, and that's fine as long as we're not irritating a tendon. So, you know, at some point, if stretching and you like yoga and you like some of the poses that go into stretching, it's totally fine to go into those positions if it's something you enjoy. It's not needed for running, but during a time of tendinopathy, it can be problematic.
So we've got 7 or 8 minutes left in this show, and if I were to say, I've been sitting here for the last 2 hours and I'm going to go for a run after this, are you saying even though I'm feeling stiff, with emphasis on the word feeling stiff, does that mean I shouldn't stretch before I go running? And if I shouldn't stretch, what should I do?
You don't need to stretch, because that stiff feeling is not shortened muscles, but you do need to wake up your movement a little bit. So it's not a great, like, you just want to get the tissues warmed and ready to go. They've been in one position for a while and they've kind of probably adapted to that. So a good idea is just to start walking a little bit before you run, just kind of get things moving. It also gets us kind of in a mental state to run. And, you know, I think we know warm-ups don't mean as much as we used to think they do, but I think, in my opinion, and this is debated, I think they're still good. I think they're still good to get you moving, to kind of build up slowly so you don't just go from all to nothing. And then it's also a chance to kind of just play with some movement, just kind of like, I'll put some marching in there or some different movement patterns, just to kind of remind our nervous system how we can move, and so that we can pull from those movements in a run. And I think it helps to keep us athletic. It's also time. It gives us time back. If we put that into our run, then we can take that out somewhere else. And runners don't have a lot of time, you know. So if you can just get some movement before you're running, it's done. You've done it. So I think that's a good way to do it.
And you made a term right there. I don't know whether you did it consciously or unconsciously. It says it gives you time to play. Mm-hmm. And unless you're making money as a runner or as a cyclist or whatever you're doing, I mean, for the people who are running the Pittsburgh Marathon for the most part this weekend, this should be fun. It should be play. So they finish, and if they're successful with that, you know, we're looking at Sunday afternoon on how does somebody come back from a marathon? You know, not a professional runner, but somebody, they ran the marathon, and obviously they're going to have some soreness Sunday afternoon and into Monday, maybe even for a week. How should their training look as they go beyond the marathon and maybe look to some 10Ks this summer and maybe a fall marathon?
I mean, again, I think it depends on the timing of what they have set up, and, you know, there's, you know, some and the experience of the runner, and there's so many factors at play there. But ideally, they would be a little active the week after the marathon, maybe just walking, getting moving. We know complete rest is not good for us unless, again, we're dealing with a bone stress injury, which we didn't get into. But so, you know, we'd want them moving a little bit. If it was time for like an off season, so I do think runners need to have an off season, which doesn't mean not running. It means just backing off a lot on their running. So that might be take a few weeks off, and then start building up your strength training, because now is the time to kind of strength train, because we're going to run a little bit, and then just start running casually, conversation pace, like 3 times a week, you know, just every other day, not on back-to-back days, and just because we want to stay consistently running so we keep those tissues active. And then as we progress back to our running season a little bit while later to the next race, again, timing matters there, we would then start slowly decreasing our strength training and increasing our mileage, maybe start adding in our intensity runs, our tempo runs, things like that. So but again, that depends on how spaced, if that's your off season. If you're still in season, you're going to have another race, you might just take time off and just start with, you know, a lighter run and then get right back to it, you know. So again, it goes back to programming what's coming up, but there should be some kind of off season, And I think the main thing is I want people to know off season doesn't mean don't run. It just means don't train. Don't be at peak performance during that time, and alter your running load and increase your strengthening load.
And we'll finish up asking you with a question about kids. I mean, we could spend an entire session on kids, but I know you've got young girls, and they may one day, because mom works with runners, say, you know, Mom, I want to run a marathon or I want to run a 10K. As a parent and as a medical professional, what's your path, or what are your ideas of what's the best path for progressing? Is there a distance limit if your daughter, when she's 14, says, Mom, I want to run a marathon, even if it's just on my own and you and Dad giving me water bottles out of the car? What's your theory on that?
It's complex. I'm not 100% sure that kids should be running distance, and so I'm not vilifying it. I'm just saying we have to be very careful with how we do it, because it's an endurance activity. So, and we have peak bone development between the ages of 8 to 14, which is the only time in your life when your bones actually get larger. So the diameter, the bone density can change. So during that time, we need to be doing cutting activities. And so running doesn't build that bone. So we might, if they're only doing running, they might miss that window to build bone health. And then there's energy deficiencies. That is a whole nother topic to get into that can be very serious. So it's a lot of responsibility to be a runner, to be able to eat and eat the right nutrition so we don't get into these energy deficiencies. And then there's also stress issues, the way we've taken running and made it now, which used to be a stress relieving sport, and we've made it now, it's usually a sport that's picked up after you've played other sports when you're older, and we put it in place, and now we put it as a pressure-filled sport. So it creates a whole ball of trouble for kids, and we can probably make it happen if we're aware of this stuff and we put in some strategies to manage it. But I think like every other sport, it's becoming younger, earlier, and specialized, and it's very complex.
And it sounds also that when you talk about this, especially with youth, it's not just relying on the coach. Each parent has to ask questions and maybe recognize that every child or every kid is an N of one, so what works for the team may not necessarily work for your son or daughter.
Yes, and that's really true for like cross country and other sports, is really knowing your athletes, knowing the kids, knowing that this is a time where things can go really wrong with nutritional issues, and plus the social issues and like eating and other things and running that could really set them up for problems down their line. So it's not something that we can just ignore, and it's often not discussed and talked about because it can sometimes be touchy, especially if you start getting into menstrual cycles and things like that, which can be an indicator of a problem. But it is something we need to talk about because it is a pretty big issue, and I think the fact that it's growing and becoming more competitive, we're going to start to see some major issues down the line.
We've been talking with Kelly Kuhn. She is a physical therapist who works, I think, not only with runners, but active people, and would prefer to work with active people because they're fun to work with, even though other groups of individuals may also be fun to work with. But if people are hearing this and they want to learn more about you, or maybe they have questions and they want to take advantage of their services, how can they find you?
So my website is just my name, www.kellykuhnpt.com. I couldn't think of a more fun name. I'll take suggestions. So you can just find me there. It has my email and my phone number, and easy place to contact me.
Thanks for joining us for another edition of Movement is a Lifestyle. We believe movement is a lifestyle because movement is part of what makes your life complete. At the end of the day, don't be afraid to try a new activity. Don't be afraid to seek out medical help from somebody like Kelly if you need it. And have fun, because it shouldn't be, as Kelly said, it shouldn't be a stressor. It should be a good thing.